The ground gave way without warning. 1 second, packed snow. The next, gone. 8 feet down into darkness and silence in the particular cold that does not ask permission. She stood at the edge and looked down, 9 degrees below zero. January. No one else for 20 minutes in any direction. The wind moved across the empty white field like something searching. She had two choices: ride back, get help, the sensible thing. She grabbed the rope, because somewhere below her, a man who had spent 7 years building walls around everything he felt was turning the wrong color. Because 6 weeks ago, she had signed a contract that said this was a transaction, no sentiment, no complications, because her hands were already moving before her mind caught up. She tested the post. Once, twice. Then she went down into the dark after him. Wyoming. November 1, 1889. The advertisement was 11 lines long. Winifred had read it 4 times before she set the newspaper down. Then she picked it up and read it again, because something in those 11 lines kept snagging at her. Something that felt less like a trap and more like honesty, which was so rare in the literature of matrimonial arrangements that she genuinely needed a moment to be sure she was reading it correctly. Wanted. A woman of practical mind and sound constitution for a domestic arrangement of mutual benefit in Coldwell, Wyoming territory. Applicant must be in good health, of steady temperament, and unbothered by hard winters. Sentiment unnecessary. References required. Apply in writing only to S. Vane, Post Office, Coldwell, Wyoming. Sentiment unnecessary. She had not seen those 2 words together in any document she'd ever read. Marriage listings promised devotion. Widowers seeking housekeepers promised comfort and security. Even the most businesslike arrangements dressed themselves up in the language of companionship, of warmth, of something that sounded like it might eventually be worth wanting. This one didn't bother. Sentiment unnecessary, like it was a feature. Like the man who wrote it had thought carefully about what he was offering and decided that honesty was more valuable than presentation, which was either the most refreshing thing she'd read in years or a warning sign she was too desperate to recognize as such. Probably both. Winifred was 31 years old. She had been rejected 27 times by men who found her too direct, too educated, too unwilling to soften herself into something more palatable. She had been fired from the Whitmore Academy for Girls 3 months ago for teaching algebra to students whose fathers had paid for embroidery and deportment. She had received a letter from her brother Percival last Tuesday that began, "You have always been difficult," and ended with the suggestion that she consider teaching in a Western territory where standards were, as he put it, more accommodating of unconventional women. She'd found the advertisement the following morning, which was either coincidence or the universe making a point. And Winifred had always preferred to believe the universe was making points rather than producing coincidences, because at least points had the dignity of intention. She wrote her response that afternoon. 2 pages. Clear. Specific. No flattery. She listed her qualifications: 8 years of teaching mathematics, working knowledge of bookkeeping, excellent health, no dependents, no attachments, no illusions. She stated her conditions plainly. She asked one question: what exactly are the terms? She received a reply in 9 days. 4 paragraphs, equally direct. The terms, as promised. A travel allowance enclosed. She packed 1 trunk. She bought a ticket. She did not tell Percival where she was going, because his opinion was no longer something she was in the business of collecting. The stage from Cheyenne to Coldwell took 6 hours over roads that suggested Wyoming had strong feelings against comfort. Winifred spent the journey reading, which earned her a suspicious look from the only other passenger, a cattle buyer from Nebraska who seemed personally offended by a woman with a book. She didn't explain herself. She never did. Coldwell appeared without ceremony. 3 streets of wooden buildings, a church, a general store, a bank with new paint, and a saloon with old everything. The landscape beyond it was the kind of vast that made Boston feel like a very crowded room. Flat in some directions, and then suddenly not. Gray-green and brown and enormous, and absolutely indifferent to human opinion about it. The stage stopped. The driver called out. Winifred collected her bag and stepped down into wind that found every gap in her coat simultaneously. Vane Ranch was a mile outside of town. The driver had been kind enough to continue on. She saw it before they arrived. Practical buildings. No wasted ornamentation. Corrals with cattle that looked better fed than most people Winifred had known in Boston. A main house that was larger than expected but communicated nothing except function. Everything said, "This is a place where work gets done." And anyone who came here expecting otherwise was going to have an educational experience. A man stood on the porch. Sutton Vane. He was not moving, not walking toward the stage, not raising a hand in acknowledgement. Just standing, arms at his sides, watching with the focused stillness of someone who had decided observation was more valuable than greeting. He was younger than she'd expected, mid-30s at most, dark hair, jaw assembled by someone with strong opinions about structural integrity. A scar along his left cheekbone she'd notice later, up close. Right now he was just a silhouette in November light, and the weight of his attention was something she could feel from 30 feet away. She stepped down, picked up her bag before the driver could make the offer, walked toward the house. He waited. "Miss Ashworth." Not a greeting. A confirmation, like he was checking something off a list. "Mr. Vane." She stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. She was not going to crane her neck. If he wanted to conduct this conversation from a position of physical advantage, he could come down to her level. His expression moved. Not quite a smile. Something more assessing. "You're older than I pictured." She had been prepared for this. Men always said something like this when they'd expected easier and found instead. "Your advertisement didn't specify an age requirement. If that's a problem, I understand the stage returns Thursday." He looked at her for a moment. Then, "It's not a problem." He stepped down from the porch. Up close, he was taller than she'd estimated. Broader, with the physical density of a man who worked with his hands and didn't think about it. "I don't need a girl. I wrote that in my second letter, I remember. You need a woman who understands what she's agreeing to, and do you?" "I understood it when I wrote to you," Winifred said. "I understood it on the stage. I understand it now. The question of whether I find the terms acceptable is still open. I'd like to discuss them before either of us decides anything." Something shifted in his expression. Not approval, exactly. More like recalibration. Like he'd been bracing for a different kind of conversation and had to adjust his footing. "Come inside," he said. "We'll talk." The house was exactly what the outside promised. Clean floors, functional furniture, a fire in the stone hearth that provided heat rather than atmosphere. No photographs on the walls, no personal objects on the shelves. The only sign that a human being lived here, rather than simply operated here, was a stack of agricultural journals beside the armchair and a coffee mug that had been set down and forgotten on the window ledge. A woman appeared from the kitchen. 58, maybe. Solid build. Gray hair pinned with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped caring about appearance and started caring about practicality a long time ago. She looked at Winifred with eyes that were taking in considerably more than they were giving back. "Mrs. Birch," Sutton said. "Miss Ashworth, I know who she is." Mrs. Birch wiped her hands on her apron. "Sit down, dear. Coffee's hot." "You look frozen. I'm fine," Winifred said. And then, because the woman's directness was genuinely refreshing after 6 hours on a stage with a man who'd radiated disapproval at her reading. "But yes, coffee would be welcome." She sat. She hadn't been invited to, exactly. Sutton was still standing. She sat anyway, because she was 31 years old and she had been standing in one form or another for most of her adult life, and she was done performing discomfort for the sake of other people's expectations about where women should position themselves. Sutton's expression did something complicated. Then he sat across from her. "I'll be direct," he said. "Please," he paused. Like the please surprised him, like he'd been prepared to override resistance and found agreement instead and had to reshuffle. "I need an heir. Someone to inherit this ranch when I'm gone. I don't have time for courtship. I don't have interest in the..." He stopped. Started again. "I'm offering a business arrangement. You'd live here, bear a child, be provided for, your own room, access to the house, a monthly allowance, medical care, and in return, a child." Winifred smoothed her skirt. The room smelled like wood smoke and something that might have been coffee and might have been the scent of a space where no one had laughed in a long time. "What happens after the child is born?" "You'd stay as the mother. The child would need raising. In what capacity?" His jaw worked. "You'd have your own quarters. I wouldn't interfere with your time. As long as the child was properly cared for." "You're describing a governess who happened to give birth." "I'm describing an arrangement that benefits us both." "Does it?" Winifred set down her coffee. "Walk me through my benefits, Mr. Vane. Specifically..." He looked at her with an expression she would come to know over the following months. The look of a man recalibrating. Again, security, a home, financial stability, full parental rights written into the agreement, and if I can't conceive, the contract protects you regardless. If you decide you'd rather end the arrangement, settlement. Enough to start over. It's in the terms. Winifred held his gaze. You've thought about my exit more carefully than most men think about a woman's entry. His mouth tightened. Not anger, something else. I've been on the wrong end of a poorly written contract before. I didn't enjoy it. She accepted that. Filed it. I'd like to see the document. He produced it from the desk in the corner, which meant he'd had it ready, which meant he'd expected her to ask, which told her something about him she found more interesting than anything he'd said so far. She read it slowly. The document was meticulous. Monthly allowance. Generous, specific, with cost of living language she wouldn't have expected. Private quarters in the main house. Access to all common areas. Full medical care during pregnancy and post-birth, with no limitation on scope or cost. The child would carry the Vane name, but Winifred would retain complete parental rights, no conditions, no contingencies. If either party wished to dissolve the arrangement after the birth, a settlement would be paid. Enough, she calculated quickly, to purchase a small house and live independently for several years without financial strain. And then, buried in paragraph 7, a clause she read twice. The party of the second part shall not be required to perform any domestic service beyond the care of the child and the maintenance of her own quarters. Cooking, cleaning, and general household management are the sole province of existing household staff. He had specifically written her out of domestic servitude. In 1889, in Wyoming, Winifred set the document down. You had this prepared before I arrived. I've had 3 responses to the advertisement. You were the only one who wrote about terms instead of about Wyoming sunsets. The others wanted a story. You wanted a contract. I wanted clarity. She looked up at him. There's a clause here that specifically exempts me from household labor. Mrs. Birch runs the house. That's not why you wrote it. A pause. Just long enough to be significant. No, why did you write it? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because I didn't want you to feel like hired help. What I'm asking is already, he stopped. Jaw tight. The terms should reflect that. Winifred looked at him, at the carefully controlled face, and the perfectly still hands, and the scar on his cheekbone, and the coffee mug forgotten on the windowsill. At the man who had written protections into a contract that no court in Wyoming would have required of him, I have conditions, she said. Beyond what's written, such as, I want access to the ranch accounts, not to manage them, to work with them. I'm good with numbers, and I need to be useful in ways beyond, she paused. Selected a different word. Beyond the obvious, he frowned. That's not necessary. It is for me. A beat? Fine. I want meals together. At the same table. Like people who inhabit the same house. We're doing that now, under negotiation. I want it to be ordinary. His jaw shifted. He nodded, and I want honesty. If something isn't working. If you're reconsidering. If there's a problem. I want you to say so rather than let resentment build into something that poisons everything. He looked at her steadily. I can do that. Can you? She held his gaze. Because everything about you suggests you'd sooner swallow glass than discuss a problem before it becomes a crisis. His eyes were gray. She hadn't noticed until right now in the afternoon light from the window. Gray like the Wyoming sky outside, the shade that meant weather was coming, and you could either prepare for it or pretend it wasn't. Both options available. Only one of them intelligent. I've been told I'm difficult, he said. So have I. She picked up the pen from the desk. That's possibly the first thing we have in common. She signed her name. Winifred Eliza Ashworth. Steady. No hesitation. When she looked up, Sutton was watching her with an expression she couldn't yet read. She would learn to read it. Eventually, it meant he was frightened and refusing to acknowledge it, which was, she would discover, his default state. Welcome to Vane Ranch, Miss Ashworth, he said. Mrs. Vane, she corrected. If the contract is signed, the name applies. Something flickered in his expression. Fast. Gone. Mrs. Vane. She did not sleep the first night. The room was good. A large window facing east. A bed that was real furniture rather than an apology for one. A writing desk she would use. A bookshelf. Unexpected. Already filled with volumes someone had left behind. Natural philosophy. Agricultural science. A battered copy of Jane Eyre that made her stop and look at it for a long moment before she put it back. She lay in the unfamiliar dark and listened to the ranch settle around her, cattle in the distance. Whined against the glass and then, Footsteps in the hall, slow and deliberate, back and forth. Sutton. Pacing, he was as awake as she was. That told her something. Mrs. Birch was in the kitchen before dawn, moving between stove and counter with the efficiency of someone whose body had long since memorized the sequence. She looked up when Winifred appeared, said nothing for a moment, then, "Coffee's hot. He's already out with the men." Winifred poured a cup and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the sky was the color of iron. A man was crossing between buildings at a pace that communicated purpose. Not Sutton. "Too slight? How long have you worked here?" Winifred asked. 4 years. Since he bought the place, Mrs. Birch kept rolling dough. Hands confident and unhurried, he's a fair employer. Demanding. But fair. Is he always so contained? You mean, does he ever act like a man who lives inside a human body instead of a filing system? A slight smile. Occasionally. Usually when something's gone wrong with the herd. Even then, more cold than fire. What happened to him? Mrs. Birch was quiet for a moment, kept her hands moving. Then she set down the rolling pin and looked at Winifred directly for the first time. "Not my story," she said. "But I'll say this. He wasn't always stone. Something broke in him years back, and he chose to stay broken rather than heal crooked. There's a difference. Broken men who know it, who chose it, they can choose different. If someone gives them reason, you're telling me I should try. I'm telling you he's worth the effort. If you're inclined to make it," Mrs. Birch turned back to the dough. "I'm also telling you this ranch is not kind to the uncertain. If you're not sure why you're here, figure it out fast." Winifred looked out the window at the vast gray-brown landscape stretching all the way to wherever Wyoming decided to stop. "I'm not uncertain. Good." The rolling pin resumed its work. "Then you'll do fine." She spent that afternoon in the barn office. Found it by following the logical sequence. Where would accounts be kept given the size of this operation? The office was small and smelled like horse and old paper. Shelves of ledgers, each labeled in a compact and precise hand. Feed costs. Cattle inventory, employee wages, land tax records going back 3 years. She pulled the most recent ledger and began to read. Finding what you need? She turned. Sutton stood in the doorway, dusty from the morning's work, hat in his hand. His hair was damp with sweat despite the cold, and he looked less assembled than he had this morning. More like a man who actually worked and less like a man performing the concept of working. "I was curious about the operation," she said. "Not apologizing for being here, and you run this place like you're expecting to be audited. Everything documented, everything cross-referenced." She looked back at the ledger. "There's an error in your hay allocation for October. You've been categorizing supplemental winter feed under capital expenditure instead of operating costs. It's affecting your quarterly projection." Silence. She looked up. He was staring at her. "It's a small thing," she said, "but it compounds. If you want, I can show you." He moved into the small office. Not toward her exactly, toward the shelf behind her, reaching for a different ledger. His arm brushed hers. Both of them went still. It was nothing. Accidental. The room was small and physics had done the rest, but the stillness stretched one beat too long, and she could see the pulse in his throat, and his breathing had changed. And she was suddenly and completely aware that she had agreed to do something very consequential with this man, and he was standing close enough that she could smell wood smoke and cold air and whatever soap he used. He grabbed the ledger he'd been reaching for and stepped back. "Sorry. Didn't mean to crowd you, you didn't." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I was in your way. This is your space now, too," he said. "As much as mine." He left before she could answer. She stood alone in the small office, her heart doing something unnecessary and inconvenient, and thought, "This is going to be considerably more complicated than the contract suggests." The first week established patterns. Mornings, Mrs. Birch, coffee, the business of the day. Winifred worked through the ledgers, correcting small errors, flagging inconsistencies, making notes in the margin in her precise hand. Sutton came by the office each afternoon to review what she'd done. He never said good work, never said thank you. But each correction was incorporated without argument. And on the 4th day, she found that he'd reorganized the filing system according to a note she'd left, half suggesting, half explaining, tucked between the October and November ledgers. He hadn't mentioned it. She didn't either. Evenings. The dining table. The Wyoming Tribune. Winifred read aloud from the opinion pages, not because she required an audience, but because silence that wasn't chosen was a slow suffocation, and the best solution to a room full of things unsaid was to fill it with words that didn't require response. Sutton ate. Occasionally, very occasionally, he made a sound that might have indicated he was listening. On the fifth evening, she read a particularly wrong-headed editorial about women's suffrage and stopped mid-sentence to say, "This man has clearly never met an actual woman." A pause from across the table, then, without looking up from his plate, he married one. She left him in 1884, took the dog. Winifred looked at him. "I grew up in Philadelphia," Sutton said. "I know who writes for that paper." She put the newspaper down. He was still looking at his plate, but the corner of his mouth had moved. Just slightly, so he was in there. Good. On the seventh evening, he knocked on her door. Winifred had been expecting it. Mrs. Birch had given her a look over breakfast that communicated more information than most people delivered in a full conversation. She'd spent the day neither dreading nor anticipating, which she considered a reasonable psychological achievement under the circumstances. She opened the door. Sutton stood in the hallway, clean, but still in work clothes. His expression was what she was coming to think of as his filing things face, arranged into deliberate neutrality because the alternative was something he wasn't ready for. "It's time," he said quietly. "I know." She stepped back to let him in. The room felt smaller with him in it. The lamp was turned low. She'd done that before he arrived, not for atmosphere, she told herself, but because certain things were simply easier in shadows, less clinical, less like something being transacted. "You can still say no," he said, standing near the door, not moving toward her. "Contract or no contract, I'm not saying no if you're not ready." "Sutton," she said his first name for the first time. Watched him register it. "I've made my decision. You don't need to keep offering me exits I'm not taking." Something moved in his face. Fast and unguarded, and gone before she could name it. She reached for the lamp and turned it lower. What followed was not what she'd prepared for. She had prepared for efficiency, for the discomfort of necessity, approached practically. She had not prepared for the way he said, quietly and only once, "Tell me if I hurt you," and seemed to actually mean it, not as a formality, as a genuine concern that came from somewhere real. She had not prepared for the stillness afterward, the way he didn't move toward the door. She fell asleep before she consciously decided to. The last thing she was aware of was his breathing, careful and controlled. From the chair by the window, at 3 a.m, she woke. He was still there, not in the bed, in the chair. Awake, or nearly, she couldn't tell in the dark. But present, still, not gone. She considered saying something, decided against it, closed her eyes. He was gone before dawn. She found him in the barn office the following morning. He was reaching past her for a ledger, the same small space, the same accidentally close proximity, and this time she turned before he could retreat. "You stayed last night," she said. He didn't answer immediately. "I don't know what you're referring to." "Yes, you do." A pause. Jaw tight. Hands very still. "I fell asleep in the chair." It wasn't intentional. She looked at him steadily. "That's interesting." "Why?" "Because you're a man who controls everything in his orbit with the precision of a military operation. You don't do anything unintentionally." She held his gaze. "You stayed because you wanted to. And you're standing here telling me it was an accident because admitting you wanted to is more frightening than anything else I could ask of you." His breathing had changed. She could see it. The slight shift in his chest. "Don't," he said. Very quiet. "Don't what?" "Don't look at me like you can see through me." "I'm not looking at you any particular way," Winifred said. "I'm just paying attention." "You might try it sometime." She picked up the ledger she'd actually come for and walked out of the office, leaving him there with his hands not quite steady and no filing system in the world adequate to categorize what had just happened. November deepened. The cold sharpened. They moved through the days side by side, not touching, not exactly, but occupying the same space with a growing ease that Winifred noticed and chose not to name. She caught errors in the accounts. He accepted them without comment. She read aloud at dinner. He listened, even when he pretended he wasn't. She asked questions about the ranch that were genuinely curious, and he answered them. First briefly, then in more detail, then once, standing at the corral watching the cattle in late afternoon light, for nearly 20 minutes straight, explaining the economics of winter feed and spring calving with the unself-consciousness of a man talking about something he actually loved. He caught himself mid-sentence. Went quiet. "Don't stop," Winifred said. "I'm boring you. You're not." He looked at her sideways, suspicious, like a compliment was a thing to be inspected for hidden mechanisms. "I'm a schoolteacher," she said. I know the difference between someone talking because they think they should and someone talking because they know something worth knowing. You know things worth knowing. He was quiet for another moment. Then he kept talking small things, accumulating, like snow, the pattern of nights repeated over the following weeks. Every few nights, a knock at her door. Each time afterward, he stayed, in the chair first. Then, on the third occasion, she said without particular ceremony, "The chair looks uncomfortable. You can sit on the bed." He did. And then on the fifth occasion, when she was nearly asleep, she felt the mattress shift, careful, deliberate, with space between them, and she thought, he is so frightened, and he is still here. That means something. She did not say any of it out loud, because some things needed to be true before they needed to be spoken. And she had learned over 31 years of being too quick with words in rooms that weren't ready for them, that timing was as important as accuracy. She found him in the library one evening in late November. He was staring at an open agricultural journal without reading it. The fire had burned low, and the room smelled like old paper and cold air from a window that didn't seal perfectly. "You've been avoiding dinner," she said. "I've been busy. You're never not busy." "This is different." She sat in the opposite chair. "Tell me what's wrong," he looked at her. For a long moment, nothing. Then, "It's getting harder. What is leaving?" He set the journal down. His hands weren't steady. "After, I stay until you're asleep, and then I leave, and every night it takes longer to make myself go. And that's what?" "That's not acceptable." His voice was tight. "We have an arrangement. A clear one. And I'm standing here telling you I'm having trouble leaving your room at 3 in the morning like someone who wants to stay." Silence. "Yes," he said. Like it cost him a significant amount. She looked at him, this controlled, frightened, careful man who had written protections into a contract no one required of him, who had stayed in a chair all night and called it an accident, and said, "Then stay, Winifred. I can't. If this becomes something, it's already something, I know." He stood, paced the small room. Too much energy for the space. "That's exactly what terrifies me." She stayed in her chair and watched him pace and did not try to stop him. Because some things needed to exhaust themselves before they could rest. Because he was not a man you could catch. He was a man you had to wait for. When he finally stopped in front of her, breathing a little uneven, she said, "Come upstairs." He went very still. "Not to my room," she said. "To yours. Your space. So you can't run. So you have to stay." He stared at her, something cracking in his expression. Not breaking, cracking, which is different, which means light can get in. "That's the bravest thing I've ever heard anyone say," she said. "And I'd like you to say yes." He didn't say yes. He turned and walked toward the stairs and looked back once to see if she was following. She was. His room was exactly what she'd expected. And exactly what broke her heart. Sparse. Functional. A bed, a dresser, a single chair by the window. Nothing on the surfaces. No photographs, no objects that said, "A person lives here and he has history and memories and things he values." Just a room where a man slept and a pocket watch on the nightstand. Tarnished silver. She didn't ask about it. She sat in the chair. He sat on the edge of the bed, removing his boots with the economy of someone performing a nightly ritual that had never before had a witness. She felt suddenly, acutely, that she was seeing something private. Not intimate exactly. Private. The quiet mechanics of a life conducted entirely alone. "You don't live here," she said. "You just occupy the space. I'm not sentimental. It's not about sentiment. It's about evidence." She looked around the room. "A room that looks like this says the person in it doesn't believe they're worth the trouble of making something comfortable." He set his boot down. Didn't look at her. "That's a significant conclusion from a bare dresser. It's not just this dresser." She kept her voice level, not unkind. "It's everything. The way you run this ranch like you're trying to prove something to a room with no one in it. The way you wrote a contract that protects me better than the law requires because someone once didn't protect you, and you decided that meant you should be the kind of person who compensates. The way you stayed in that chair all night and couldn't admit it was because you didn't want to leave." He was very still. "I'm not pitying you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I don't pity you. I'm just stating what I observe." "And what do you observe?" "A man who deserves more than he's allowing himself." Long silence. He lay back against the headboard. Fully dressed, staring at the ceiling. She stayed in the chair. The window rattled in the wind. 7 years ago, he said. Philadelphia, she waited. Her name was Adeline. Old money. Connected family. Exactly the kind of woman a man building a fortune was supposed to want. He was speaking to the ceiling, like it was easier. She knows me across a room at a cattle auction. She knew about breeding stock, genuinely, not as performance. I was 28. I had just made my first real profit. I thought I had won some kind of lottery. Winifred did not move. Did not speak. 6 months of courtship. Her father approved because my money was new enough to be exciting. We set a date. I signed over half my assets in a pre-wedding contract she said would prove I trusted her. His voice was completely flat. The flatness of someone who has processed grief past the stage where it produces inflection. She was involved with my business partner, Owen, for at least 3 months before the wedding. He couldn't carry it. Told me everything. Said she'd approached him. That it had been planned. I'm sorry, Winifred said. Don't be, I learned. He finally looked at her across the dim room. I lost half my assets. The partnership. My standing in Philadelphia. I came out here and built something from what was left. On purpose. Somewhere no one knew me. Somewhere I could control the variables. A pause. And then I placed an advertisement because you wanted to try again, she said. Not at romance. At trust. Those are different things. Something moved through his expression. Yes, he said. Quiet. I suppose that's it. She stood up from the chair, walked to the bed, sat on the edge, careful, leaving space between them, not touching. Just closer. I'm not Adeline, she said. I know, I'm not going to tell you pretty things I don't mean. I'm not going to be soft when I'm not. I'm not going to pretend this arrangement is something it isn't, or that I'm something I'm not. She looked at him directly. But I'm also not going to disappear into the walls and behave like hired help, and I'm not going to let you treat yourself like a man who forfeited the right to want things. His throat worked. What do you want? He asked. From this. From me. Honestly. To be seen, she said. Not my usefulness, not my function. Me, as I actually am. Difficult and opinionated and not particularly warm by anyone's conventional measure. She held his gaze. I've spent 31 years being told I'm too much. I would like, for once, to be exactly enough. He looked at her for a long time in the dim room. In the silence, then he reached out slowly, like he was learning the motion, and took her hand, just that. Just her hand in the dark. You are, he said. Exactly enough, she believed him. Not because she was naive. Because she had been paying attention for 3 weeks, and Sutton Vane did not say things he didn't mean. He barely said things he did mean, which is why, when he said this, it landed with the weight of something true. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, soft and deliberate, like it had been waiting for the right moment. Inside, 2 people who had been alone for a very long time sat in the dark and held hands and didn't talk, and it was, for both of them, in ways neither would say aloud for some time yet, the least alone either had felt in years. Wyoming. Late November 1889, the snow came on a Tuesday, not the gentle preliminary dusting of early November. This was the real thing, the kind of snow Wyoming produced when it had something to prove. By morning, the world outside the kitchen window had been replaced by a different world entirely, white and absolute and without apology. Winifred stood at the glass with her coffee and looked at it. Behind her, Mrs. Birch was moving between the stove and the counter with her usual efficiency. Not rushing. Never rushing. Just steady. The steadiness of a woman who had seen enough Wyoming winters to understand that panic was a luxury the weather didn't honor. East fence is down, Sutton said from the doorway, already dressed for outside. Already wearing the look that meant he'd been cataloging problems since before dawn. You're not going out in this, Mrs. Birch said. Not looking up. 3 posts snapped in the wind. Cattle are contained for now, but if the drift builds along the north pasture, the drift will do what the drift does, regardless of whether you freeze to death trying to stop it. Mrs. Birch set a plate on the table with more force than strictly necessary. Sit. Eat. The fence will be there tomorrow. Sutton looked at the plate. At the window. At the plate. He sat. Winifred hid her expression behind her coffee cup. Because watching Sutton Vane be managed by a 60-year-old woman with a rolling pin was, she had no other word for it, delightful. And she was not going to say so, because she had some sense of self-preservation, even if the evidence for this was occasionally thin. You think this is funny, Sutton said. Not looking at her, I think Mrs. Birch is an extremely effective person. She's terrifying. She's right, Winifred said. Those are not mutually exclusive. Mrs. Birch made a sound that was absolutely not a laugh. Sutton ate in the silence of a man metabolizing a lost argument. Outside, the wind picked up. The house creaked. Somewhere in the distance, Cattle complained about the weather in the resigned way of creatures who have learned that complaining doesn't change anything but have decided to do it anyway. How long will it last? Winifred asked. Day. Hey? Hey. Maybe 3. Sutton pushed eggs around his plate. Could be a week. Weather here doesn't follow rules. Nothing here follows rules, he glanced at her. Including you. I follow rules, she said. Just not stupid ones, and you get to decide which are stupid. Someone has to. Mrs. Birch set down her rolling pin and turned around and looked at both of them with the expression of a woman watching 2 dogs circle each other around a single bone. You two, she said. Sound married? The word landed in the room like a plate dropped on a stone floor. Sutton went still. The kind of still that Winifred had learned meant something was happening behind his eyes that he absolutely was not going to let reach his face. He set down his fork, stood, said he'd be in the library, left before anyone could respond. Winifred looked at his abandoned plate. Mrs. Birch looked at Winifred. Give him a few minutes, the older woman said. Not unkindly, I'm not going to give him a few minutes. Winifred set down her own cup. He's been running from that word since I arrived. At some point, running has to meet a wall. She followed him. The library was a small room off the main sitting area. Shelves on 3 walls, a desk, a window that faced the barn. Sutton was standing at that window with his back to the door, not looking at anything. Just standing in the way of a man who has put as much distance between himself and a feeling as the room's dimensions allow. What happened just now? She said. Nothing happened. You fled. I didn't flee. I removed myself from a... You fled. Sutton. The chair was still moving when you left the table. She closed the door behind her. Mrs. Birch said, we sounded married and you disappeared like the room was on fire. Why? He turned around. His expression was the controlled, assembled version. Every piece in place. Which meant whatever was underneath was significant enough to require that much architecture on top of it. We're not married, he said. We have a signed contract, a shared name, a shared house, and we are attempting to conceive a child together. What part of that? Marriage implies permanence. The word came out harder than he intended. She could tell by the slight tightening around his eyes after he said it. It implies continuation, commitment. He stopped. She waited. Things I'm not able to offer, he finished. Queeder Winifred looked at him for a long moment. At the careful face and the tight hands and the man behind all of it who had stayed in a chair all night and still couldn't admit why. You think this is temporary, she said slowly. He didn't answer. After everything. After you told me I was exactly enough. After the library last week and the nights you've stayed, you still think I'm going to leave. Everyone leaves. His voice was flat, not cruel, just worn, like a truth repeated so many times it had lost its edges. Or they betray. Or they take what they can and go. That's what I've learned. That's what I know. That's what Adeline taught you. That's what experience taught me. That's what one person did to you, Winifred said. And you've been applying the lesson to everyone who came after her ever since, including yourself. Something moved through his expression. Fast. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. She stepped closer. Not to crowd him. Because I did the same thing. After the 27th rejection. After I stopped trying to fit myself into shapes I wasn't. I decided needing someone was weakness. I told myself I was better off alone. That I could survive without. She stopped, breathed. Surviving isn't living, Sutton. I know the difference. I lived the difference for 8 years. It's very quiet and very safe, and it hollows you out so slowly you don't notice until one morning you wake up and the room is perfectly arranged and completely empty. And you realize you stopped wanting things because wanting things made you vulnerable. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, unguarded. Almost young, and then you placed an advertisement. He said quietly, that wanted no sentiment. And then I answered it. She held his gaze, because something in me still knew, still believed it was possible, to be seen, to be chosen, by someone who didn't need me to be different. She reached out, touched his arm, felt him go very still. I'm not Adeline. I'm not going to smile at you across a room and mean something else. I'm not going to take things from you under the cover of affection. What I am is exactly what you see. Difficult and precise and not particularly soft. And I'm standing here in Wyoming in November telling you I'm not leaving. Not because of the contract. Because I choose not to. The silence in the room was absolute. Outside, snow continued to fall. What if I can't? He stopped, jaw working. What if I can't be what you need? What if I keep doing this? Running. Retreating. Building walls in the middle of the night when I'm not paying attention, then I'll knock on them, she said. Like I'm doing now. That sounds exhausting. You're worth the effort, he made a sound. Not quite a laugh. Something more fractured. You've known me 6 weeks. I'm a very fast reader. This time it was almost a laugh, almost real. He looked at her with that fierce, frightened, barely held together expression and said, "What do you want from me, Winifred? Honestly, right now, I want you to stop deciding in advance that this ends badly." She kept her voice steady. "I want you to stay. Not just in the chair, not just in the house. In this, whatever this is becoming, I want you to let it become it." He looked at her for a long time. Then, slowly, with the deliberateness of a man picking up something he'd been afraid to touch, he reached out and took her hand. "I'll try," he said. "That's all I'm asking." December arrived and the world froze solid. The snow didn't leave. It accumulated, packed down, became the landscape rather than something on top of it. The ranch hands moved between buildings in the hunched, purposeful way of men who had made peace with the cold long ago. Mrs. Birch made stews that lasted 3 days and bread that disappeared in one morning. Sutton checked everything twice and then checked it again because that was the only way he knew how to hold fear at bay. And Winifred worked through the account ledgers and read aloud at dinner and played chess on the old set she'd found in the library. She lost to Sutton 3 times before she stopped letting him see when she was watching his strategy. "You're improving," he said on a Thursday evening in mid-December. "You're not paying attention?" She moved her queen. "Check." He stared at the board. "That's how did you... You've been watching my rook for 20 minutes. I moved my bishop while you were distracted." "By what?" "By me." She said it simply, factually, without coyness. He looked up from the board. She met his eyes without a flinching. Because she had learned, over 6 weeks of close observation, that Sutton Vane responded to honesty the way people respond to fresh air after a long time in a closed room, like he'd been without it long enough to actually notice when it arrived. "You're going to be insufferable if you win," he said. "I'm going to be insufferable regardless. This just gives it context." He looked back at the board. "I concede. You absolutely do not get to concede. You have to sit here and watch me win properly." He made a sound. She was cataloging those sounds now, the almost law, the actual law, rarer, more real, the sound he made when she'd said something that surprised him and he didn't want to show it. This was the almost law. It was becoming one of her favorite things. "Fine," he said. "Win properly." She did. Christmas Eve, 1889. Mrs. Birch had gone to her sister in Coldwell for the holiday. The ranch hands were in the bunkhouse with a bottle and a firm prohibition on working until noon the following day. The main house was quiet, in the particular way of a space usually occupied by multiple people, suddenly occupied by 2. They ate dinner in the kitchen. Mrs. Birch had left specific instructions and provisions for approximately 40 meals, which Winifred found both touching and slightly alarming. Roasted chicken, potatoes. A pie that had required more consultation than she was willing to admit and had turned out better than expected. Sutton ate and looked at his plate and looked at her and looked at his plate. Something was different about tonight. She could feel it. The way you feel weather changing before the temperature actually moves. "Tell me about Philadelphia," she said, before all of it, before Adeline and Owen and the rest. "What were you trying to build?" He was quiet for a moment. "My father was a dock worker. Good man. Worked himself to death. Literally, which I thought was a metaphor until it wasn't." He pushed a potato around his plate. "I was going to be different. I was going to build something that lasted. Something that said, I was here. I mattered." A pause. "Turned out building something isn't the hard part." "What's the hard part?" "Deciding who you're building it for." He finally looked at her. "I thought I was building it for myself. Then I thought I was building it for Adeline. Then I came out here and built it for..." He stopped. "For what?" He looked at the table. "For whoever might eventually be sitting across it from me." Winifred put down her fork because that was a great deal. That was more honesty than he'd managed in a single sentence in all 6 weeks. That was Sutton Vane. Without warning, saying something true in the middle of a Christmas Eve dinner over roasted chicken. And she was not going to cry about it because she had more dignity than that, probably. After dinner, they sat by the fire in the sitting room. He read an agricultural journal. She read Jane Eyre, which she had finally retrieved from the library shelf because it had been looking at her long enough. The fire crackled. Outside, snow fell silently on a silently sleeping ranch. At some point, without either of them deciding, she had shifted closer on the sofa, and he had not moved away, and her shoulder was against his arm, and he had turned a page and settled slightly, and his arm had come carefully around her shoulders like it was ordinary, like it had been ordinary for years. She thought, this is it. This is the thing I didn't know how to want. Not dramatic. Not declared. Just a man's arm around her shoulders on a winter evening, real and warm and chosen. She turned a page. He turned a page. Outside, Christmas arrived quietly. The trouble with Cordelia Hatch came 3 days after Christmas. On a Thursday, Winifred was in the barn office when she heard an unfamiliar carriage arriving. She looked out the small window. A woman was stepping down from a very well-appointed buggy, assisted by a driver who looked like he was doing it under sufferance. 60, perhaps. Severe in the way of women who have confused severity with authority for so long the distinction has ceased to matter. Dressed for a social call despite the weather. The kind of dress that communicated, this visit cost me nothing and costs you specifically something. Winifred watched her walk toward the main house. Then she closed the ledger and followed. She arrived in the sitting room 30 seconds after Mrs. Hatch had been admitted by no one. The woman had simply walked in, which told Winifred everything she needed to know about how Cordelia Hatch related to spaces she considered beneath her. Sutton was not in the house, in the north barn. Winifred knew this, and Mrs. Hatch apparently did not, which suited Winifred perfectly. Mrs. Hatch, she said from the doorway. The woman turned, examined Winifred from hat to hem with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making assessments and pronouncing verdicts without being asked. Miss Ashworth. A loaded pause. I believe it's Mrs. Vane now. Though I understand the distinction may be somewhat technical, there it was. Winifred walked into the room, sat down in the chair nearest the fire, the better chair, the one that faced the door, and folded her hands in her lap. How can I help you? Mrs. Hatch, I wanted to introduce myself. As a neighbor, as a member of the Coldwell community, the woman remained standing, ensuring Winifred had to tilt her head up, which Winifred declined to do by directing her gaze to the middle distance and allowing Mrs. Hatch to manage her own eye contact. This town has certain standards, and when someone new arrives, particularly in circumstances as unusual as yours, it falls to those of us who maintain those standards to make the situation clear. Which situation? Winifred asked pleasantly. There are several in play. Everyone in Coldwell knows what kind of arrangement this is. Mrs. Hatch's voice was precisely calibrated, not loud enough to be called hostile, not quiet enough to be anything other than intentional. A man places an advertisement. A woman arrives from a city with no family connections, no community standing. References Winifred supplied. He required references. I provided them. From the headmistress of the Whitmore Academy in Boston and the Reverend Dr. Alcott of the Second Congregational Church of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Should I fetch the letters, or will you take my word for it? Mrs. Hatch's composure flickered. 1 degree. What people are saying. I know what people are saying, Winifred said. Seems pleasant voice. People say things in proportion to the amount of useful information they're lacking. A woman who arrives in a small town without a traceable romantic narrative is a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. She tilted her head slightly. What specifically are they saying so I can address the least accurate version? They're saying you were acquired for a specific purpose. Like livestock? Winifred was quiet for 1 beat. 2. I signed a contract, she said. A legal document prepared by Mr. Vane's attorney in Cheyenne, reviewed by my own representation before I signed it, which specifies my rights, my allowance, my living arrangements, my parental rights, my medical care, and my settlement terms in the event either party chooses to dissolve the arrangement. It is more thorough than the legal protection to most women who marry in this territory. A pause. If that's livestock, I'd recommend it to most women I know. Silence. Furthermore, Winifred continued, I managed the accounts for this ranch. I identified 3 significant errors in the quarterly projections within my first week here and corrected them with Mr. Vane's full sanction. I work. I contribute. I am not kept. She met Mrs. Hatch's eyes directly, which she'd been avoiding strategically until this moment, because directness at the right moment had more weight than directness deployed too early. And I'm not particularly interested in the opinion of a woman who walked uninvited into a house that isn't hers to deliver a message I didn't ask for. Mrs. Hatch opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I know what you were doing, Winifred said. Not unkindly. You were establishing hierarchy, seeing if I'd defer. I won't, so we've both saved ourselves considerable time. She stood, easy, unhurried, at her own initiative. Thank you for the introduction, Mrs. Hatch. I hope the drive back to town isn't too cold. She walked to the door of the sitting room and held it. Mrs. Hatch left. Sutton found out 20 minutes later. He came to find Winifred in the barn office, stood in the doorway. Looked at her with an expression doing several things at once. You should have come to get me, he said. You were in the north barn. I would have come, I know. She kept her eyes on the ledger. But I didn't need you to. A pause. She's influential in town. The bank, the church committee. Hatch money goes back 20 years in Coldwell. If she decides to make things difficult, then she decides to make things difficult. Winifred looked up. I've been managing difficult people since I was 22 years old. I'm not afraid of a woman who uses a social call as an ambush. He was quiet. You should have said something, she said. And her voice was different now. Less brisk. Not to Mrs. Hatch. On my behalf, I didn't need that. But after you stood there and watched her dismiss me and you said nothing and then you left the room, she held his gaze. You claimed to be done with people using your silence against you, but you used it against me. He looked like he'd been struck. Carefully, precisely, in exactly the right place. As he stopped. That's accurate, she said. I'm not angry, Sutton. I'm telling you because we agreed to be honest with each other. And honestly, when she called this arrangement something it isn't, when she implied I have no standing, no dignity, no claim to be here, I wanted you to say something. Not because I couldn't handle her, because it would have mattered. From you, he stood in the doorway long enough that she thought he'd retreat again. That the wall would go back up and she'd have to find the door in it all over again. Then he said, Jan, you're right. She waited. I should have been there. I let you handle it alone because it was easier. Because engaging meant he stopped. Tight. It meant admitting publicly that this is real, that you matter here, that this isn't just an arrangement. Yes. Is that so frightening? She asked. Admitting out loud that I matter? He looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Simply honestly. Because the last time I admitted someone mattered, I was wrong about whether it was mutual. Winifred softened, not visibly. Inside, something shifted. Because that was the truest thing he'd said yet, and he'd said it without being pushed to the edge first. Then act like you know the difference, she said quietly. He breathed. Short, sharp. Then he nodded. I'll speak to her. If she makes trouble. Thank you, Winifred said, and that was enough. The library. December 29th, the second major storm of the season had locked the world solid for 2 days. The wind made the kind of sound against the windows that made even Mrs. Birch's confident stillness feel like a choice rather than a default. Winifred found Sutton in the library at 4 p.m, standing at the window, watching nothing. She sat in the chair across from his and picked up her book and read 12 pages without absorbing a single word. Then she set it down. Tell me about her, she said. The whole of it, not the facts. I have the facts. Tell me how it felt. He turned from the window. Why? Because you're carrying it into every room you walk into. And I'd like to know what I'm sharing space with. He was quiet long enough that she thought this would be another retreat, another carefully managed nothing. Then he sat down. I fell for her in an afternoon, he said. That's the embarrassing part. One afternoon at an auction in Denver. She knew about cattle. Not performer's knowledge, real knowledge, the kind you earn. I was 28. I thought I was someone worth noticing. He paused. She noticed me. Winifred waited. 6 months of courtship. Her father approved because my money was new enough to excite him and substantial enough to reassure him. I thought I had built something worth belonging to. Built a life that could hold a person. He was looking at his hands. She asked for a prenuptial settlement, said it was about equality, about proving I didn't intend to control her financially the way most husbands controlled their wives. She made it sound progressive. I thought she was right. You signed. Half my assets. In a legal document, his voice was completely flat. The flatness of someone who has processed grief so many times the emotions have worn smooth. Owen came to me 3 weeks before the wedding. He'd been involved with her for 3 months. He said she'd approached him, that it had been coordinated, that he'd been too weak to refuse and too cowardly to confess until guilt became something he couldn't carry anymore. And Adeline married someone else within the year. Spent through his money inside of 2. He looked up. I sold everything. Left Philadelphia. Came here. Built this, he gestured, at the room, the house, the land beyond the window. Far enough away that the story couldn't follow me. The story followed you anyway, Winifred said quietly. Yes, it always does. That's not a failure of geography. That's just how wounds work. She leaned forward slightly. You weren't naive, Sutton. You were generous. Those are different things. Everyone says that. I'm not everyone. And I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's specifically, technically true. Naive would have meant missing warning signs. Were there warning signs at the time? He was quiet. No, he admitted. Then you weren't naive. You were willing to trust. And willingness to trust isn't stupidity. It isn't even vulnerability, exactly. She paused. Found the right word. It's courage. That went wrong. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the guarded assessment, not the controlled blankness. Something more open, like the man under the one he'd built was occasionally visible if you caught him at the right angle. You're very different from what I expected, he said. What did you expect? Someone more conciliatory, someone who would make this easier by wanting less. That sounds dreadful. It does now. The corner of his mouth moved. It seemed practical when I wrote the advertisement. Nothing practical ever survives contact with an actual person, Winifred said. That's the fundamental problem with planning for people in the abstract. 27 experiences, specifically. He looked at her. Tell me about them. So she did. Not all 27, that would have taken the rest of the winter. But she told him about the pattern. The way she'd walked into each potential future with the same hope. The hope of being known, actually known, not performed for, and the way she'd walked out of each one having failed the particular test courtship required. Too direct, too intellectual, too unwilling to soften herself into the shape a husband expected to receive. She told him about the last one. A professor at Harvard, brilliant, who had seemed for 3 months to actually see her. He told me he found my mind extraordinary, she said. And then he told me it would need to become less extraordinary after we married, because extraordinary women made ordinary men feel insufficient. Sutton was very still, and that was the 27th, she said, and then I stopped trying for 2 years. I taught, I saved money. I was sufficient and contained and quietly miserable, she met his eyes. And then I read 11 lines in a newspaper that said sentiment unnecessary. And I thought, at least he's honest about what he doesn't want. And now? She looked at him across the library in the winter afternoon light, with the storm outside and the fire behind her and the book she hadn't been able to read still open in her lap. Now, I think, she said carefully, that what you don't want and what you're afraid to want are different lists entirely. He didn't answer, but he didn't look away. January 4th, 1890. The letter from Percival arrived with the weekly Post. Fred read it at the kitchen table while Mrs. Birch pretended to be very interested in the bread she was making. It was 4 pages long. The first page established that their maternal grandparents had died within 6 weeks of each other in November. The second page explained the terms of the will, a modest sum, divided between Percival and Winifred per the explicit instructions of both grandparents. The third page explained that Percival was contesting this division on the grounds that Winifred's current living situation represents a moral circumstance incompatible with the standards of the Ashworth family name. Therefore, she should sign the enclosed release and save them both the embarrassment of a legal proceeding. The fourth page was the release, already prepared. Just needing her signature, Winifred folded the letter, set it on the table. Drank her coffee, Mrs. Birch continued, kneading with the focused attention of a woman who was absolutely not listening. He wants me to sign away my inheritance, Winifred said, because my living situation is, his word, incompatible with the family name. Said Mrs. Birch. I'm going to write back and decline. I'm not going to tell Sutton because it doesn't involve him. A pause in the kneading. Carefully resumed. She wrote her letter. Short, specific, legally precise. She had, over 8 years of teaching and managing students and parents and employers, acquired the ability to write a politely devastating reply. She sent it with the next post delivery. She filed the matter. He found the original letter 10 days later. She had left it in the barn office, not by design, not by carelessness exactly, just with the particular ease of a woman who had decided the letter was resolved and stopped thinking about it as something requiring protection. It was under a stack of feed invoices. He moved the stack. He read it. She knew he'd read it before he said anything because she came into the office at 3 in the afternoon. and found him standing at the window with the expression he wore when something had happened that he was deciding how to handle. "I've contacted Whitmore and Baines in Cheyenne," he said. "They'll have a representative in Philadelphia within the month." Winifred stopped. "They specialize in estate litigation," Sutton continued. "Your grandmother was explicit in her will. The grounds Percival's is using aren't." "Sutton," he kept going, "they're not legally sufficient. The moral clause argument hasn't been upheld in Pennsylvania courts since." "Sutton." Her voice was quiet. "Precise." "Stop." He stopped. She looked at him. At this man who had, while she wasn't looking, gone ahead and taken action in her life without asking, and who clearly believed this was the same thing as helping. "You went to a lawyer on my behalf," she said, "without telling me." "I was trying to protect. I know what you were trying to do." She set her ledger down carefully. "I want you to hear exactly what I'm about to say because I'm going to say it once and I need it to land." He was very still. "When Percival sends letters telling me my living situation is incompatible with the family name and decides my inheritance should be his because he has appointed himself the arbiter of my choices, he is doing what men who believe they know better than women do. He is deciding for me." She held Sutton's gaze. "When you contact a lawyer in my name to protect rights I am capable of protecting without asking me first, you are doing the same thing with better intentions. The intentions don't change the structure. The silence was a living thing. I didn't." He stopped, something working behind his eyes, actually processing, not defending. "I didn't think about it that way. I know you didn't." She kept her voice level, not cold. "Because you were worried, and when you're worried, you act. And you've been making decisions alone for 7 years on this ranch, and no one has told you they'd rather be consulted. You're telling me now, I'm telling you now." A pause. "I'm not angry, Sutton. I'm telling you because this is the thing between us that will grow if we don't cut it now. Protecting me and controlling me look identical from where I'm standing. The only difference is whether you asked." He looked at her for a long moment. Then, "I'm sorry, simple, direct. No qualifications. No elaborate explanation." She exhaled something she hadn't known she was holding. "Thank you. Should I withdraw the inquiry?" "No." She picked up her ledger again. "The lawyer is a good idea. I had already decided to pursue it myself. I just would have liked to be in the room when the decision was made." He nodded, once. The nod of a man who has understood something real and intends to remember it. "Next time," he said. "Next time, January 19th, 1890, the third storm of the season, and this one was serious. The sky had gone the color of iron on the 18th, and Sutton had spent the afternoon in the Northfields, checking the fence line before the worst of it hit. Winifred had watched from the kitchen window and thought, he's going back out tomorrow. She knew him well enough by now to know that the east fence, the one that had snapped in November, temporarily patched, still structurally insufficient, was in his mind every morning. She knew he would go. She also knew she wasn't going to let him go alone. The morning of the 19th, she put on every layer Mrs. Birch had assembled for her over the previous months. Long underwear, wool skirt, heavy coat, Sutton's spare boots stuffed with 3 pairs of socks until they fit approximately. She looked in the mirror like a woman who had lost an argument with a supply closet. She didn't care. Sutton was in the barn, saddling the 2 horses he used for fence checks. When she walked in, he saw what she was wearing, said, "No, good morning," she said, Winifred. "No, I'm coming. It's dangerous. The snow is unstable in places. The wind along the north fence line." "I know." She moved to the smaller horse, the one he'd been putting her on during the occasions they rode the perimeter together. She'd become a competent rider over 2 months. Not graceful, but absolutely competent. "I've also been reviewing the terrain notes you keep in the barn office, so I know which sections are the concern. That's not the point." "The point," she said, checking the stirrup length the way he'd taught her, "is that you're going out in uncertain conditions alone, and if something goes wrong, there's no one to send for help, because all the hands are rotating through the south pasture this morning." She looked at him over the horse's back. "I'm coming. We can discuss it now, or we can continue this conversation from horseback." He stared at her. His jaw was doing the thing. "You're impossible," he said. "You've mentioned that," she said, and mounted. The fence line was 20 minutes from the barn at their pace. The landscape in full winter was extraordinary in the way of things that could kill you. White and absolute and enormous. The sky a flat gray ceiling pressing down on a white floor. with only the dark lines of fence posts and the occasional leafless tree to mark the difference between earth and air. The break was where Sutton had expected. 3-3 posts snapped clean. The temporary bracing from November had failed completely. Gap wide enough for cattle to drift through if the wind pushed the herd north. He dismounted. Assessed. Unstripped the repair supplies he'd brought. Wire, pliers, replacement posts bundled across the second horse. She held both horses and watched him work with the complete efficiencies of a man who had done this same task in various conditions more times than he could count. He was fast, focused, unhurried in the way of someone who knows that urgency and panic are different things and has long since learned to deploy only one of them. She was watching the snow. There was something about the surface 20 feet to Sutton's left that had been bothering her since they arrived. The way the light hit it differently. The way it didn't quite look like the snow around it. She said. Almost done, Sutton. One more. The ground opened, not dramatically, not with noise, just gave way. Quietly, like something that had been waiting patiently for exactly the right pressure. And Sutton dropped 9 feet. The sound he made wasn't a shout. It was a single sharp involuntary sound cut off by impact. Then silence. Winifred tied both horses to the nearest fence post. 3 quick hitches, hand steady, which she would think about later, because right now she could not afford the time to find that strange. She dropped to her knees at the edge of the collapsed ground and looked down. He was alive. Sitting in the snow at the base of the hole, one hand braced against the wall. His face was tight with something between pain and the particular fury of a man who has just been undone by geography. I'm all right, he said. Your leg. He looked at his left leg. The angle wasn't right. Ankle. Might be sprained. He tested it. His expression changed. Don't what? Don't do the face. What face? The face that means you're deciding something. He looked up at her. Go back. Get Hayes and Collins from the south pasture. They're 15 minutes, 20 minimum, in this snow. It's the sensible option. It's the option where you're alone in a hole in January for 20 minutes in falling temperatures. She was already unstrapping the rope from the repair supplies. Tying one end to the fence post she'd used for the horses. Testing it twice. I'm going to lower the rope. Try to use it. He caught the rope. Pulled. His face told her everything about whether he could get himself out. She pulled from above. Made no difference. Physics had opinions, and none of them were helpful. She sat at the edge of the hole and looked at the rope in her hands and looked at Sutton 9 feet below her and thought, he is getting colder. It is getting darker. The horses are tied but not patient, and I cannot get him out from up here. So she went down, not gracefully, using the rope, half sliding, landing in a heap next to him in the snow. He made a sound she'd never heard from him before. Something between frustration and something rawer. Winifred. I know. She pressed against his side, sharing what warmth she had. I know. I couldn't pull you out alone. And I wasn't going to leave you. You should have. I know what you think I should have done. She was scanning the walls of the hole. Not sheer. There were places where the snow had packed against the sides, where it might be possible to cut footholds. I made a different decision. A dangerous one. Yes. She started cutting with the repair knife she'd brought. Methodical. Now stop talking and let me work. He was quiet. She could feel him shivering. Not badly yet, but the cold was absolute, and the hole had no sun, and time was a variable she needed to manage. Yell, she said. Loud. As loud as you can. Sound carries differently in snow. The hands might be closer than we think. He looked at her. Then he called out. Loud enough that she felt it in her sternum, even standing next to him. She cut footholds. He called out at intervals. She packed snow into them, tested them, rejected two, found a sequence that might hold. Time passed in the way of situations that demand everything, simultaneously endless and compressed to nothing. Then, above them, she heard it. A voice. Distant. Then closer. Hayes. She would find out later that he'd heard the shout on his third pass along the south fence and had been moving toward them for 8 minutes. That he'd brought Collins and a longer rope and the strongest horse. That he'd nearly ridden past the hole because the snow around the edges looked undisturbed until you were directly on top of it. They got Sutton out first, then Winifred. The process was inelegant and cold, and involved considerably more rope management than anyone had expected. When she was standing again on solid ground, in the white-gray afternoon light, she felt Sutton's hand find her arm. Grip it. You stayed, he said. Very quiet. Yes, you could have the sensible thing. I know. He looked at her. His face was pale with cold and pain and something else, something that had been building for months and had apparently decided today was the day it would stop waiting. I need to tell you something, he said. You can tell me at the house, she said. Where it's warm, I need to tell you now. He held her gaze. His hand on her arm was the only warm thing in the landscape. I love you. I hadn't planned to say it like this. I hadn't planned to say it yet, but you just climbed down into a hole in January instead of leaving me. And he stopped. I love you. She looked at him. This pale, shaking, half-frozen man in the middle of a Wyoming field, saying the most important sentence of his adult life while a ranch hand pretended to inspect the horses behind them. I know, she said. You? I've known since Christmas. She kept her voice steady. I was waiting for you to catch up. He made a sound. Somewhere between a laugh and something that wasn't. You might have mentioned it, he said. You might have mentioned it first, he breathed. Cold air, his grip on her arm hadn't loosened. How long are you going to be infuriating about this? That's genuinely impossible to predict, she said. Let's get you home. Dr. Alcott arrived by evening. He was a grizzled man who had been practicing medicine in Wyoming long enough to have stopped being surprised by the situations people arrived in. He examined Sutton's ankle, badly sprained, possibly a partial ligament tear, and examined Winifred for cold exposure. Both were told in terms that admitted absolutely no negotiation that they were confined to rest for a minimum of 3 days. Sutton argued, briefly. Then looked at Dr. Alcott's expression and stopped. The ranch hands can manage, Winifred said, from the chair where Mrs. Birch had wrapped her in approximately 4 blankets. 3 days won't ruin anything. You don't know that? Hayes has been running this fence line for 3 years. He knows what to do. Sutton looked at her. The look of a man who has, for the first time in 7 years, actually considered delegating something important. Fine, he said. Dr. Alcott left. Mrs. Birch made soup. The fire was built high, and Sutton, installed on the sofa with his ankle elevated and 3 blankets and approximately none of the dignity he preferred to project, looked at Winifred across the sitting room and said, "Come here." She moved to the sofa. He shifted, careful of the ankle, and made room. She sat beside him. His arm came around her shoulders. Automatic now, like it had always been the position things returned to. I meant it, he said. Quiet, what I said out there. I know you did. It's taken me. I know that too. She settled against his side. You don't have to explain the journey. You arrived. That's enough. He was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you for not leaving me in the hole. Don't thank me for that. Why not? She looked at the fire. At the warmth of a room that is warm because people have chosen to fill it, because that's just what you do, she said. When it matters, he pressed his lips to her hair. Brief, quiet. Outside, the storm made its last complaint against the windows and began finally to ease. The ankle healed slowly, which Sutton found intolerable, which everyone around him found entirely predictable, which produced, over the course of 10 days, a running disagreement between him and every person on the property about what the word rest actually meant in practical application. Day 1. He attempted to review the accounts from the sofa. Winifred moved the ledgers to the barn office without comment. Day 2. He sent written instructions to Hayes via Mrs. Birch. Hayes sent back a note that said in its entirety, "We know, sir." Day 3. He got as far as the front porch before Winifred appeared in the doorway behind him, coat in hand, expression neutral, and said, "Where are you going? Fresh air. The fresh air is 32 degrees, and your ankle is the size of a turnip." It's not. It's a large turnip. "Come inside." He came inside. Because she was right, and he knew it, and arguing with Winifred about things she was right about was a particular kind of exhausting that he was beginning to suspect was actually good for him, like cold water and difficult exercise. Unpleasant in the moment. Clarifying afterward, Winifred ran the accounts during his recovery. Not just managed them, ran them. She came to him every evening with a summary of the day's decisions, not for approval exactly, but as a briefing. As a partner briefing another partner. He found he liked this more than expected, more than felt entirely safe. On the 4th day, she told him she'd authorized the purchase of 40 additional head of cattle. He stared at her. At what price? $6.40 per head. The Garrison herd went on emergency sale, family illness. They needed cash before the end of the week. Normal price would be $9.50 in spring. She set the invoice on the sofa beside him. I checked your available capital against projected winter costs first. We have the room. He looked at the invoice, at the numbers, at the clear, precise logic of the transaction. And then he looked at her. "You've been planning this?" he said. "I've been watching the garrison situation for 2 weeks. You mentioned in December that their eldest son was sick. I flagged it as a potential." She sat in the opposite chair. "If you think it was the wrong call, it was the right call." A pause. "Completely the right call," he stopped. Because what he was feeling was not just approval of a financial decision. It was something more unsettling, something that felt like being known by someone who had paid enough attention to know what mattered and had acted on it while he was sitting on a sofa being difficult about fresh air. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." She didn't say anything else, which was its own kind of generosity. The letter from Owen arrived on a Wednesday. February 12th, 1890, Mrs. Birch brought in the post. Sutton was in the library. He could manage the library now. With the ankle brace and a cane he found humiliating and used anyway, and he took the mail in the afternoon. She came in at 5 for dinner and found the dining table set, the soup ready, and Sutton in his chair with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled blankness, not the guarded assessment. Something older, something that had been in storage for a long time and had just been brought back out into light. "What happened?" she said. He didn't answer immediately. Then he reached into his jacket and set a letter on the table between them. She looked at it, didn't touch it. "From Owen." The name like he was checking whether it still had weight. It did. She could see it. "He's dying. Consumption, I assume." From the handwriting. "He's in Denver." Winifred sat down. "He wants forgiveness," Sutton said. "What does the letter say exactly?" "That he's been carrying it 7 years. That he was weak, not malicious. That Adeline approached him first." He paused. "That he's tried to believe the distinction mattered, and he's no longer sure it does." The fire crackled. Outside, the horses shifted in the barn. "What are you going to do?" Winifred asked. "Nothing. There's nothing to do. He made his choices." Sutton's voice was flat, the old flat, the covering that went over something too large to display directly. She waited. "I thought I'd feel something clear," he said. When this happened. When something resolved. Satisfaction, maybe. Justice. Something with edges." He looked at the letter. "I just feel tired." "That's not nothing," she said. "Tired means you've been holding it a long time. Tired is what happens when you can finally put something down. I haven't put it down. Not yet." She reached across the table. Not for the letter. For his hand. Covered it. "Will you write back?" "There's nothing to say. There might be." "Not for him." She kept her eyes on his face. "For you. There might be things worth saying that you've been carrying unsaid for 7 years. Not for his benefit. For yours." He was quiet. "Carrying a verdict in your chest for 7 years is exhausting," she said. "Writing it down and sending it somewhere is a way of making it external, finished, outside of you. Even if I don't forgive him, especially then, you don't owe him forgiveness. You don't owe him anything." She squeezed his hand once. "But you might owe yourself the closure of having said what you actually think, instead of carrying the unsaid version forever." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're very rational about things that aren't rational. I'm a mathematics teacher. We like to find the variable that's making the equation impossible and isolate it, and Owen is the variable." "Owen is one of them," she said. "Adeline is another. The 28-year-old version of you who decided trust was the mistake rather than the betrayal. He's another." Sutton pulled his hand back, slowly. Not away, just back. He needed both hands for what he was about to do with his face, apparently, which was hold it together while something moved through him that had been waiting 7 years for an adequate container. "I don't know how to stop being angry," he said. Very quietly. "You don't have to stop," she said. "Anger is reasonable. Anger is accurate in this case. What you might try is letting it be anger." Not a worldview. He was quiet for a long time. Then he folded it, put it back in his jacket. "I'll think about it," he said. She took that for what it was, which was a great deal coming from him. He wrote the letter 4 days later. She didn't ask to read it. She didn't ask what it said. She knew he'd written it because she found the unsealed envelope on the hall table at 7 in the morning, addressed, stamped, waiting for the post, and because when she came to breakfast, he was sitting in his chair with the stillness that wasn't tension. That was release. "Coffee's hot," Mrs. Birch said. "Thank you," Sutton said. He looked at Winifred when she sat down. A look that said, "I did it." Nothing more. She poured her coffee and said, "Hayes says the garrison cattle are settling in well." "Good," he said. And that was that. Except it wasn't, not really. Because something had shifted in him that morning. So subtle that if she hadn't been paying close attention for 4 months, she would have missed it entirely. Something that looked from the outside like a man who had stopped bracing for impact. Not healed, not resolved, just less fortified. Like a wall that had been held at maximum tension for so long that someone had finally said, "You can ease off now. The thing you were holding back has passed," she thought. That's what grief does when you finally let it be grief. It stops being architecture, stops being the structure everything else is built around, and it just becomes something that happened, something true and terrible and finished. She thought, I love him. She'd known this for a while. She was a precise person, and she had precise language for precise things, and she had known since Christmas, or possibly before, possibly since the evening in the library when he'd told her he was building this ranch for whoever might eventually sit across the table from him, that what she felt was love, specific and unapologetic, and accompanied by the full awareness of who he was. Not who she wished he were, not who he might become. Who he was right now on a Tuesday morning in February, tired and healing and slowly, stubbornly, actually changing, she had not said it yet. Because timing mattered. Because Sutton Vane received things best when they arrived, without pressure, without drama, without a stage built around them. She would say it when it felt like a fact being stated rather than a performance being given. She would know when. The ankle was declared sufficiently healed on February 22nd. Dr. Alcott came by, examined it, said, "You're lucky," in the tone of a man who had said this to Sutton several times over the years and was beginning to find it repetitive, and prescribed continued caution for 2 more weeks and absolutely no heroics in snow. Sutton agreed with the particular solemnity of a man who intends to agree and then recalibrate based on necessity. "I know what you're thinking," Winifred said. "After Dr. Alcott left, I'm thinking the east pasture needs. You're thinking you'll test the ankle tomorrow, and if it holds, you'll be back to full schedule by the end of the week." A pause. "The east pasture," he said, "does need attention. 2 more weeks. 10 days, 2 weeks, Sutton, 12 days. She looked at him, he looked at her. This was, she had come to understand, not actually an argument. This was the dance of two people who both know how it ends, but enjoy the choreography enough to do it anyway. 14 days, she said. "And you take Hayes with you every time for the first week." "Fine, that was easy. I'm in a compromising mood," he said. "Don't push it," she pushed it. "And you tell me before you make any decisions about the spring cattle purchase. That's already the plan, is it?" It is now." His mouth moved. The almost smile. "You're very good at making things become the plan retroactively." "I'm a school teacher," she said. "We're trained in the art of making people believe the right answer was their idea." He actually smiled. The real one, the one that changed his whole face and made him look years younger and made her chest do something she had no mathematical notation for. She thought, "Now, Sutton," she said, "I love you." He went still. Not the defensive still, not the bracing for something still, a different kind entirely. The kind that happened when something landed exactly where it was meant to and the body needed a moment to understand what had just been given. "I know you find it difficult to say," she continued, because she was not going to leave him hanging in silence like a man on a ledge, "and I'm not asking you to." "I love you," he said. Caquet. Certain. The way he said everything he actually meant, without decoration, without qualification. Just the thing itself. She looked at him. "I've been trying to find the right moment," he said. "I had various versions of how I'd say it, and they all sounded like someone else saying it." "What?" "So," he exhaled. There it is," she agreed. "I loved you before the hole," he said. "I want you to know that. The hole didn't create it. The hole just made it impossible to continue pretending I hadn't. I know when it started for you," she said. "When? Christmas Eve. The thing you said about building this for whoever might eventually be sitting across the table." He stared at her. "I said that months ago." "Yes, and you've just been carrying it around, knowing, not saying anything. You weren't ready, and now I am." "Now you are." She looked at him across the sitting room. At this man who had spent 7 years in a self-constructed fortress and had spent the last 4 months finding reasons to leave the gate open. "For what it's worth, I think you've been ready longer than you know." He stood carefully, the ankle still cooperative but not enthusiastic, and crossed the room to where she sat, and he took her face in his hands and he kissed her. Not the desperate urgency of the hard nights, not the careful, tentative quality of early on. Something else, Something that felt like a rival, like two people who had been moving toward the same point from different directions and had just finally gotten there. When they broke apart, she said, "The ring," he blinked. "What? The ring in your desk drawer." "Mrs. Birch mentioned it on my third day here." She kept her face entirely neutral. "You bought it before you placed the advertisement." A pause. "She told you?" "She mentioned it. She's been managing this since before you arrived." "Yes," Winifred said. "I know. I like her enormously." He made a sound, somewhere between exasperation and the helpless affection of a man who has accepted that the people around him are consistently smarter than his plans. "Stay here," he said. He went to the library. She heard the desk drawer. He came back with a small box and set it on the table between them and sat back down across from her. "I bought it," he said, "because I was trying to have faith that someone would come who would make sense of all of this." He looked at the box. "I didn't know who. I didn't know what it would look like. But I bought the ring because I thought, if I have the ring, I'm committed to the possibility. And I needed something to commit to." Winifred was very still. "It's not fancy," he said. "I can get something else. Something with stones." She said. He opened it. Sybil gold band. Clean lines, no ornamentation. Exactly right, because it said, "This is real. This is solid. This is not performative. This is a fact presented in metal." "How did you know my size?" she said. "I guessed. The jeweler made it adjustable." He looked at her. "I measured your glove one evening when you'd left it on the hall table." So, slightly more informed than a guess, she looked up from the ring. At him. At this careful, private, methodical man who had measured her glove and bought a ring before he knew her name. "That," she said, "is the most Sutton Vane thing you have ever done." "Is that? It's wonderful." She held out her hand. He slid the ring on. It fit. Because, of course, it did. They were married on the 17th of May, 1890. The garden was Winifred's. She had planted it in March, when the ground finally accepted seed. Rows of tomatoes, beans, squash, herbs she'd ordered from a catalog and waited for with more impatience than she typically admitted to. By May, the first green was showing. Lush. But present, evidence of intention becoming fact, Reverend Marsh came from Coldwell. A practical man who conducted ceremonies without excessive ornamentation, which Sutton had specifically requested and Winifred had specifically appreciated. The guests were few. Mrs. Birch, naturally. Hayes and Collins and three of the other ranch hands, in their best clothes, standing at the back with the particular discomfort of men who had agreed to attend something emotional and were managing it with dignity. Dr. Alcott, who had been present for enough of Sutton's life to deserve a seat at this table. Reverend Marsh's wife, who cried at weddings on principle and had no intention of making an exception. No family. Winifred had none worth inviting. Percival had sent a second letter, which she had left unopened on the hall table for 3 days and then placed in the fire with the same energy she deployed for broken chalk and arguments she'd already won. Sutton had his ranch. He had the people who worked it. He had Mrs. Birch, who was not family exactly, but was something more durable than family. She was the person who had stayed when staying required no reward. That was enough. That was more than enough. Winifred wore her best dress, deep blue, the one Mrs. Birch had altered twice in the past months for changing circumstances, and she walked across the garden without anyone to give her away because she was giving herself and had been the entire time. Sutton was standing at the front near the small wooden arch Hayes had built and painted white without being asked. He was in his good coat, the dark one which he wore with the discomfort of a man who preferred clothing that didn't require decisions. His hair was combed. His hands were at his sides. When she reached him, she could see the state of his hands. "Still here," she said quietly. "Still here," he said, like it was a prayer, like he was confirming something he'd needed to confirm 3 times a day for the past 4 months. Reverend Marsh began. Winifred heard some of it. She was also watching Sutton's face, the effort of staying present, the war between the instinct to armor and the choice to remain open, the quality of a person doing the bravest thing they know how to do. When the vows came, Sutton reached into his coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper, his handwriting. Multiple folds, which meant multiple revisions, which meant he'd worked on it. She hadn't known he was going to do this. Her throat did the thing. He unfolded it. His hands were not steady. He looked at the paper, and then at her, and then at the paper, and she thought, he's going to read it. He's actually going to read it. This man who told me on my 3rd day here that he had no feelings is going to stand in front of 9 people and read a piece of paper. He wrote about having feelings. He read it. "Winifred," he said, voice rough, with something he wasn't going to name out loud. "4 months ago, I placed an advertisement for a practical arrangement. I was specific about what I didn't want. No sentiment. No complications. No one who would make me remember that I had a self worth protecting." He paused, drew a breath. "You arrived and immediately made that impossible. You corrected my accounts without asking. You argued with me about rules and then broke the ones worth breaking. You sat in my library and asked me hard questions until I ran out of walls to hide behind." Another pause. "You climbed down into a hole in January, in Wyoming, because leaving wasn't something you were willing to do." He looked up from the paper. Directly at her, "I have been afraid of loving someone again for 7 years. I want you to know, standing here in front of people, saying this out loud, that I'm still afraid. And I'm choosing to do it anyway. Because you taught me the difference between bravery and the absence of fear." He folded the paper, put it back in his pocket. "That's what I have. That's all I've got." Reverend Marsh looked at Winifred. She had not prepared anything. She had thought about preparing something and had decided against it because her prepared things had a way of becoming the speech rather than the truth, and she'd spent 31 years giving people the truth when they expected the speech. "Sutton," she said, "I was rejected 27 times before I met you, by men who wanted something softer, something more accommodating, something that required less." She held his gaze. "You put an advertisement in a newspaper that said sentiment was unnecessary, and I answered it because I was tired of pretending I was something I wasn't. I came here expecting a transaction." She paused. "What I found was a man who measured my glove and bought a ring and stayed in a chair all night because he didn't want to leave. A man who writes protections into contracts no one required him to write. A man who is standing in a garden in May in front of 9 people reading words he wrote because he thought I deserved to hear them said properly." She felt the tears and did not stop them this time. "I choose you, not because the contract says so, not because circumstances required it, because you are the only person who has ever looked at all of me, the difficult and the inconvenient and the absolutely not soft parts." And stayed, she reached for his hand. "I'm going to keep arguing with you about the tomato spacing. They're too close," he said. His voice was not entirely steady. "They're perfect," she said. "Reverend Marsh said they could, if they wished. Kiss." Sutton pulled her in and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and behind them Mrs. Birch wept openly, which she would later deny, and Dr. Alcott looked at the sky in the way of men who are crying and prefer to call it squinting, and Hayes and Collins exchanged the look of 2 people who had watched something unfold over many months, and were glad to see it arrive at something like a shore. The afternoon went the way of good afternoons. Food that Mrs. Birch had been preparing for 3 days. A bottle from the back of Sutton's cabinet that turned out to be considerably better than its position suggested. Hayes, it emerged, played fiddle, badly, enthusiastically, in a way that made dancing possible rather than elegant, which was exactly right. Sutton danced with her. He was not a natural dancer, neither was she. They stepped on each other's feet, and he made a sound when she got his left one, and she said the ankle, and he said his fine, and they kept going, and it was imperfect and warm and entirely theirs. At some point in the evening, she rested her head against his shoulder and felt his arm tighten around her and thought, I have never in my life stood in a place and felt this specifically like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. She had felt at home in places before, in classrooms, in libraries, anywhere books were. She had never felt at home in a person. This was new, and it was everything. June 14th, 1890, she woke at 5 in the morning with the nausea of a body doing something complicated and significant without her full cooperation. She lay still for several minutes, timing things, paying attention in the precise, methodical way she paid attention to everything. Then she counted backward. Then she lay in the pre-dawn quiet of a Wyoming morning and stared at the ceiling and thought, oh, just that. Not panic. Something more complicated. Because this had always been the plan, this was specifically contractually the plan, and yet somehow the plan arriving felt different from the plan being intended. The plan intended was a transaction. The plan arriving was a person coming. Sutton's arm was around her. He was still asleep. She could feel his breathing slow and even against her back. The warmth of a person who is completely trustingly asleep. She did not wake him yet. She lay there and let herself feel the thing that was happening, which was enormous and terrifying, and also She searched for the word right, like a piece of a calculation that had been unknown becoming known, like the variable finally resolving. When he woke at 6, she was already sitting up. He looked at her. He could read her by now. 4.5 months of close proximity and complete mutual honesty had produced the particular literacy of two people who have paid each other sustained, genuine attention. What is it, he said. She looked at him. Winifred, I believe, she said carefully, that we are going to have a baby. He went completely still. Not the defensive still, not the armor closing still. A different kind entirely. The kind that only happens once, the moment a person understands that something they had planned for has become something real. Are you certain? No, not yet. But I have been a precise person my entire life, and everything I'm observing suggests. She stopped. Because the precision wasn't what mattered in this moment, and she knew it. Yes, she said, I think so. Yes, he was looking at her with an expression she had no category for. Not in her experience of him, not in her experience of anyone. Something between wonder and terror. Something that had no word for it in mathematics or literature or any of the taxonomies she'd spent her life organizing. A baby, he said. A baby. Yes. He put his hands over his face, just for a moment. Just long enough to do something with whatever was happening behind his expression. Then he lowered them, and he looked at her, and his eyes were bright. All right, he said, all right. I don't have better words than that right now. His voice was rough. Give me a few minutes. Take your time. He pulled her against him, both arms, tight. She felt him press his lips to the top of her head and hold them there and breathe. I don't know how to do this, he said into her hair. Neither do I. I don't know what kind of father I'll be. I've had very limited data on the subject. You'll figure it out, she said. The same way you figured it out everything else that mattered. By paying attention. By not giving up when it's hard. By asking for help when you need it. She pulled back enough to see his face. You've been practicing? On you? On being a person who lets people in? She touched his jaw. That's the main requirement, really. He was quiet for a moment. Then, with the solemnity of a man making a promise he intends to keep, I won't run from this, I know, I mean it. Whatever happens. I won't. Sutton, she met his eyes. I know, and she did. Because she had watched this man spend 4 months fighting his own instincts and choosing differently, one day at a time, one decision at a time, and she knew what that kind of change looked like in a person. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't declared. It was accumulated evidence, too much to ignore. A man who had been one thing, slowly, deliberately becoming another. Dr. Elcott confirmed it 2 weeks later. Matter of fact, as was his way. The baby was expected in late February or early March of 1891. February, a Wyoming winter. She would spend the worst of the cold carrying their child and emerge in spring. She found this somehow entirely appropriate. The pregnancy changed the ranch, and didn't change it, Sutton hovered. Not in the way of men who hover because they believe women are fragile. She had already had one firm conversation about this in July, which had produced a genuine recalibration. But in the way of a man who has finally admitted to himself what he values and is now acutely aware that it can be lost. She let him have some of it. Not all of it. I'm going to the barn office, she said. One morning in October, you were there all of yesterday. I'll be there all of today as well. The winter supply accounts don't balance themselves. She gave him a look. The baby is fine. I am fine. The barn office is 40 feet away. If something goes wrong, I will shout. You never shout. I'll make an exception. He let her go. The chickens arrived in September. 12 of them, acquired through a trade arrangement with a neighboring farm. Winifred's project entirely, her idea, her negotiation, her management, and then she named them, Aristotle Sutton said, looking at the roster she pinned to the barn wall. He was a philosopher. He seems philosophical. He's a chicken. They contain multitudes. She pointed to the next one. Beatrice, Clementine. Newton, you named a chicken Newton. After Isaac Newton, he discovered gravity. That one seems very aware of gravity. Sutton stood in front of the list for a long time, reading all 12 names, which included, at the bottom, one simply called the Senator, a gray hen with opinions. I'm not going to ask, he said. Wise. I want it noted that this is completely reasonable poultry nomenclature. Not the words I would choose, but he was not quite suppressing the thing at the corner of his mouth. I'm going to the north pasture. Newton, my regards, she said. He didn't laugh. But he was smiling when he left. She could tell by the back of his neck. The arguments continued through autumn and into winter about the chicken coop expansion she wanted. about whether Aristotle deserved his name or simply resembled a philosopher at certain angles, about account organization and cattle rotation, and whether the parlor needed a second lamp, or whether Sutton was simply reluctant to spend money on anything that couldn't be justified on a balance sheet. He was reluctant. She bought the lamp. He pretended not to notice how much better he could read by it. Small things accumulating. Like everything worth having, February 3rd, 1891. At 2 in the morning, Winifred woke Sutton with one hand on his shoulder and said, "It's time." He was awake and moving before he'd fully processed the words. That was how he was about things that mattered, already in motion before the instruction completed. She had always found this quality both infuriating and, in moments like this, exactly what was needed, Dr. Alcott, he said, already thought about. Hayes is closer and can ride faster. Send Hayes for the doctor. She sat up slowly. And go yourself to tell Mrs. Birch. Mrs. Birch is all ready. A knock at the door. I've been awake since midnight, Mrs. Birch said through the door. I'll start the water. Send Hayes. Sutton looked at Winifred. She's extraordinary. She really is, Winifred agreed. Go. He went. The hours that followed were not romantic. They were long and physical and required everything she had, and at several points she said she thinks she would not repeat in polite company, and at several other points she said nothing at all because she was using every resource for the work itself. Sutton did not leave. She had not asked him to stay. She had not told him he had to. She had said, "You can wait outside if you prefer," and he had looked at her with an expression that said he could not imagine any version of himself being on the other side of that door while this was happening, and so he stayed. He held her hand when she needed him to. He got out of Dr. Alcott's way when the doctor needed him to. He said almost nothing, which was exactly right, because sometimes what a person needs is not words but presence. Just there, someone in the room. Solid. Not going anywhere. At 4:47 in the morning, Constance Vane arrived small, red-faced, furious at the world, which the world would simply have to get used to. Dr. Alcott announced a girl, healthy, both of them healthy. Winifred collapsed back against the pillows and felt the exhaustion of having done the most significant physical work of her life and the particular happiness of the thing it had produced. Not just the baby, all of it. This room, this man, this life she'd built in a place she'd never planned to be, with a person she'd never planned to love. Mrs. Birch took the baby to clean and wrap her. Dr. Alcott did what doctors do after. Sutton was very still beside the bed. "Come here," Winifred said. He moved to her side, sat on the edge of the bed. His face was doing the thing again. The thing with no category. "Are you all right?" he said. "I'm fine. I'm exhausted, and I feel like I've been put through a ringer, and I'm completely fine." She reached for his hand. "Are you?" He stopped. "Yes," he said, very quietly. "I am." Mrs. Birch brought the baby back, set her in Winifred's arms. Constance was small enough that the word small felt insufficient. She was the size of a future. She was the size of a decision made in faith months before she existed. She was currently staring at the ceiling with the focused expression of a person encountering existence for the first time and finding it adequately interesting. "Constance," Winifred said, testing it. "Hello," Constance made a sound. Provisional, like she was reserving judgment. Winifred looked at Sutton. He was staring at the baby with an expression she would keep for the rest of her life. Not performed wonder. Not the correct face for this moment. The real face. The unguarded, completely undone face of a man for whom everything has just become irreversibly real. "Do you want to hold her?" Winifred said. He looked up, like she'd asked him something in a language he was still learning. Yes. Yes, she transferred the baby to him. His hands? Those hands, the ranch hands? The hands that had been steady through every difficult thing and unsteady only in moments of genuine feeling, received Constance with extraordinary care. Both arms curved exactly right. He held the baby against his chest, and the baby, because she had apparently inherited her mother's instinct for finding solid things and staying there, made a small sound and settled. "She's very small," he said. "She'll get bigger, I know that." "I know that logically." He didn't look up. "She just seems real," Winifred said. "Yes, she is." Dr. Alcott and Mrs. Birch made their quiet, efficient exits. The room settled into the particular silence of before dawn with a fire burning low and a new person in it. Winifred watched her husband hold their daughter. She watched him look at Constance the way you look at something you have been afraid to want for so long that its arrival still has the quality of a shock. Not a bad shock, The kind that happens when something you had given up on turns out to have been waiting for you the whole time. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, just to let the exhaustion take the shape of rest. When she opened them, Sutton was still there, still holding Constance. The fire had burned lower. Outside, the first gray light of a Wyoming dawn was beginning at the edges of the curtains. He didn't know she was watching, which is why she saw it. He looked at the baby in his arms, this small, real, irreversible thing, and something moved through his face. From the eyes outward, something he had kept locked away for a very long time. Something that had its own weather and had been waiting years for permission to come in. He cried, quietly, without dramatics. Just tears moving down his face with no ceremony because there was no one to perform for and no reason to stop them. He had not cried since he was 9 years old and his father died. He did not know Winifred was watching. She kept very still. She thought, this is what it looks like. When a man who has been carrying the weight of not feeling finally puts it down and finds out he's been keeping something underneath it all along, something that was never lost, just buried. She thought, I am so glad I answered that advertisement. She thought, I am so glad I stayed. She closed her eyes again and let him have the moment. Private. His. The first purely private happiness she had seen in him. Happiness he wasn't explaining or justifying or apologizing for. Just feeling. Just being outside. The dawn came up over Wyoming. Pale gold. The light that belongs to winter mornings when the worst of the cold has passed and the land is just beginning to remember what spring feels like. Inside, Sutton Vane held his daughter and his wife slept, and for the first time in a very long time, possibly since he was 28 years old and had stood at a cattle auction and allowed himself to believe in possibility. He was not afraid. Later, she would read the advertisement again. She had kept the clipping in the back of the astronomy book she'd taken from the library shelf on her first day here. Wanted a woman of practical mind and sound constitution. Sentiment unnecessary. She looked at it for a long time, then she looked at the room she was in. At the evidence of a life actually lived in it. Books left open on tables. Coffee rings on the window ledge. Finally, a sleeping baby in the cradle Sutton had built over the course of December with the focused energy of a man who needed to do something with his hands while other things were happening in his chest. A household where Mrs. Birch made bread and Hayes sometimes came in for coffee, and 12 chickens with names occupied a coop that had been built to hold 6. She looked at the man in the chair beside the cradle, who had fallen asleep with his head tipped back, arms loose, with the particular abandon of someone who has stopped bracing for the worst and decided, tentatively, to rest. She thought of the line she would never write on any advertisement, for any purpose, because it was not the kind of thing that could be put in 11 lines in a newspaper, the thing she had learned here in this cold and enormous landscape with this difficult and extraordinary person. That the people who are worth the effort are often the ones who don't know they're worth it. That trust rebuilt from rubble is more durable than trust that was never tested. That love, real love, the kind that sees the difficult parts and chooses anyway, isn't something that happens to you. It's something you decide every morning. In small ways, in ordinary rooms, Sutton opened his eyes, looked at her, then at the cradle, then back at her. You should sleep, he said. I was reading. You're always reading. You say that like it's a criticism. It's an observation. So he stood carefully and came to sit beside her on the bed. Looked at the clipping in her hands. What are you reading? She held it up. He looked at it for a long moment, at those 11 lines, at the thing he'd written before he knew who she was. Before he knew what he was actually asking for, I was very certain, he said. About what you didn't want? Yes. And now. He took the clipping from her hand, set it on the nightstand. Then he looked at her with the unguarded, unarchitected face she'd come to know as the realist version of him, the one that only appeared when he'd stopped deciding what he was supposed to look like. And now, he said, I don't recognize the man who wrote that. She leaned against his shoulder. His arm came around her, automatic. Like breathing, like something the body does because it has long since stopped needing to be instructed. Outside, Wyoming continued in its enormous, indifferent, beautiful way. Snow still on the distant peaks. Green beginning tentative in the valley below. The chickens, including Aristotle and the senator and Newton, who was indeed very aware of gravity, conducting their business in the yard with tremendous conviction. The ranch went on, the work went on. The arguments went on about tomato spacing and account organization, and whether Aristotle deserved his name or simply happened to resemble a philosopher at certain angles, and about the second lamp Winifred was already planning for the study, and about whether Constance had Sutton's jaw or Winifred's stubbornness or both, which seemed increasingly likely. All of it went on. And every morning Sutton Vane woke up next to his wife and chose again the thing he'd spent 7 years being afraid of. And every morning it was easier than the day before. Not easy. Never completely easy. But easier, which was, she had always believed, exactly how anything worth having worked. You didn't arrive at it, you moved toward it, one ordinary day at a time. One small choice at a time, one conversation in a cold library, one hand held in the dark, one woman climbing down into a hole in January because leaving was not something her body would agree to. All of it adding up to something that neither of them had known how to want until they found it. Here, in Wyoming, in a house that finally had coffee rings on the window ledge, he had written "Sentiment Unnecessary." What he had meant, without knowing it, was, "I am waiting for someone who will make sentiment feel like survival." She had answered, "I am that person," and she was.